"I want to burn that doll shop." Madeline told us this. She was feeding to the fire in the grate the folded dresses of that dead daughter, white lace and beige linen, crinkled shoes, bonnets that smelled of camphor balls and sachet. "It means nothing now, any of it." She stood back watching the fire blaze, and she looked at Claudia with triumphant, fiercely devoted eyes. I did not believe her. So certain I was, even though night after night I had to lead her away from men and women she could no longer drain dry, so satiated was she with the blood of earlier kills, often lifting her victims off their feet in her passion, crushing their throats with her ivory fingers as surely as she drank their blood. So certain I was that sooner or later this mad intensity must abate, and she would take hold of the trappings of this nightmare. Her own luminescent flesh, these lavish rooms of the Hotel St. Gabriel, and cry out to be awakened, to be free. She did not understand it was no experiment, showing her fledgling teeth to the gilt-edged mirrors. She was mad. But I still did not realize how mad she was, and how accustomed to dreaming, and that she would not cry out for reality, rather would feed reality to her dreams, a demon elf feeding her spinning wheel with the reeds of the world so she might make her own web-like universe. I was beginning to understand her avarice, her magic. She had a doll-maker's craft from making with her old lover over and over the replica of her dead child, which I was to understand crowded the shelves of this shop we were soon to visit. Added to that was a vampire's skill and a vampire's intensity, so that in the space of one night when I had turned her away from killing, she, with that same insatiable need, created out of a few sticks of wood with her chisel and knife, a perfect rocking chair, so shaped and proportioned for Claudia that seated in it by the fire she appeared a woman. To that must be added, as nights passed, a table of some scale, and from a toy shop a tiny oil lamp, a china cup and saucer, and from a lady's purse a little leather-bound book for notes, which in Claudia's hands became a large volume. The world crumbled and ceased to exist at the boundary of the small place which soon became the length and breadth of Claudia's dressing-room, a bed whose posters reached only to my breast buttons, and small mirrors that reflected only the legs of an unwieldy giant when I found myself lost among them. Paintings hung low for Claudia's eye, and finally, upon her little vanity table, black evening gloves for tiny fingers, a woman's low-cut gown of midnight velvet, a tiara from a child's masked ball, and Claudia, the crowning jewel, a fairy queen with bare white shoulders, wandering with her sleek tresses among the rich items of her tiny world, while I watched from the doorway, spellbound, ungainly, stretched out on the carpet so I could lean my head on my elbow and gaze up into my paramour's eyes, seeing them mysteriously softened for the time being by the perfection of this sanctuary. How beautiful she was in black lace, a cold, flaxen-haired woman with a Cupid doll's face, and liquid eyes which gazed at me so serenely and so long that surely I must have forgotten. The eyes must be seeing something other than me, as I lay there on the floor dreaming. Something other than the clumsy universe surrounding me, which was now marked off and nullified by someone who had suffered in it. Someone who had suffered always, but who was not seeming to suffer now, listening, as it were, to the tinkling of a toy music box, putting a hand on the toy clock. I saw a vision of shortened hours and little golden minutes. I felt I was mad. I put my hands under my head and gazed at the chandelier. It was hard to disengage myself from one world and enter the other, and Madeline on the couch was working with that regular passion, as if immortality could not conceivably mean rest, sewing cream lace to lavender satin for the small bed, only stopping occasionally to blot the moisture tinged with blood from her white forehead. I wondered if I shut my eyes would this realm of tiny things consume the rooms around me, and would I, like Gulliver, awake to discover myself bound hand and foot, an unwelcome giant. I had a vision of houses made for Claudia, in whose garden mice would be monsters, and tiny carriages and flowery shrubbery become trees. Mortals would be so entranced, and drop to their knees to look into the small windows. Like the spider's web it would attract. I was bound hand and foot here, not only by that fairy beauty, that exquisite secret of Claudia's white shoulders, and the rich lustre of pearls, bewitching languor, a tiny bottle of perfume, now a decanter, from which a spell is released that promises Eden. I was bound by fear, that outside these rooms, where I supposedly presided over the education of Madeline, erratic conversations about killing and vampire nature, in which Claudia could have instructed so much more easily than I, if she had ever showed the desire to take the lead. That outside these rooms, where nightly I was reassured with soft kisses and contented looks that the hateful passion which Claudia had shown once, and once only, would not return. That outside these rooms I would find that I was, according to my own hasty admission, truly changed. The mortal part of me was that part which had loved, I was certain. So what did I feel then for Armand, the creature for whom I'd transformed Madeline, the creature for whom I had wanted to be free? A curious and disturbing distance, a dull pain, a nameless tremor. Even in this worldly clutter I saw Armand in his monkish cell, saw his dark brown eyes, and felt that eerie magnetism. And yet I did not move to go to him. I did not dare discover the extent of what I might have lost, nor try to separate that loss from some other oppressive realization, that in Europe I'd found no truths to lessen loneliness, transform despair. Rather, I'd found only the inner workings of my own small soul, the pain of Claudia's, and a passion for a vampire who was perhaps more evil than Lestat, for whom I became as evil as Lestat, and in whom I saw the only promise of good in evil of which I could conceive. It was all beyond me, finally, and so the clock ticked on the mantel, and Madeline begged to see the performances of the Theatre des Vampires, and swore to defend Claudia against any vampire who dared insult her. And Claudia spoke of strategy and said, "Not yet, not now." And I lay back observing with some measure of relief Madeline's love for Claudia, her blind, covetous passion. Oh, I have so little compassion in my heart or memory for Madeline. I thought she had only seen the first vein of suffering. She had no understanding of death. Christ, Louis, she was so easily sharpened, so easily driven to wanton violence. I supposed in my colossal conceit and self-deception that my own grief for my dead brother was the only true emotion. I allowed myself to forget how totally I had fallen in love with Lestat's iridescent eyes, that I'd sold my soul for a many-colored and luminescent thing, thinking that a highly reflective surface conveyed the power to walk on water. What would Christ need have done to make me follow him like Matthew or Peter? Dress well to begin with, and have a luxurious head of pampered yellow hair. I hated myself, and it seemed lulled half to sleep as I was so often by their conversation, Claudia whispering of killing and speed and vampire craft, Madeline bent over her singing needle. It seemed then the only emotion of which I was still capable, hatred of self. I love them, I hate them, I do not care if they are there. Claudia puts her hands on my hair as if she wants to tell me with the old familiarity that her heart's at peace. I do not care. And there is the apparition of Armand, that power, that heart-breaking clarity. Beyond a glass, it seems, and taking Claudia's playful hand, I understand for the first time in my life what she feels when she forgives me for being myself, whom she says she hates and loves. Sorry, I'll say that again for dramatic effect. Beyond a glass, it seems, and taking Claudia's playful hand, I understand for the first time in my life what she feels when she forgives me for being myself, whom she says she hates and loves. She feels almost nothing. It was a week before we accompanied Madeline on her errand, to torch a universe of dolls behind a plate glass window. I remember wandering up the street away from it, round a turn into a narrow cavern of darkness where the falling rain was the only sound. But then I saw the red glare against the clouds. Bells clanged and men shouted, and Claudia beside me was talking softly of the nature of fire. The thick smoke rising in that flickering glare unnerved me. I was feeling fear, not a wild, mortal fear, but something cold like a hook in my side. This fear, it was the old townhouse burning in the Rue Royale, Lestat in the attitude of sleep on the burning floor. Fire purifies, Claudia said, and I said, no, fire merely destroys. Madeline had gone past us and was roaming at the top of the street, a phantom in the rain, her white hands whipping the air, beckoning to us, white arcs of white fireflies, and I remember Claudia leaving me for her. The sight of wilted, writhing yellow hair as she told me to follow, a ribbon fallen underfoot, flapping and floating in a swirl of black water. It seemed they were gone, and I bent to retrieve that ribbon, but another hand reached out for it. It was Armand who gave it to me now. I was shocked to see him there, so near, the figure of gentleman death in a doorway, marvellously real in his black cape and silk tie, yet ethereal as the shadows in his stillness. There was the faintest glimmer of the fire in his eyes, red warming the blackness there to the richer brown. And I woke suddenly as if I'd been dreaming, woke to the sense of him, to his hand enclosing mine, to his head inclined as if to let me know he wanted me to follow, awoke to my own excited experience of his presence, which consumed me as surely as it had consumed me in his cell. We were walking together now, fast, nearing the Seine, moving so swiftly and artfully through a gathering of men that they scarcely saw us, and we scarcely saw them. That I could keep up with him easily amazed me. He was forcing me into some acknowledgement of my powers, that the paths I'd normally chosen were human paths I no longer need follow. I wanted desperately to talk to him, to stop him with my hands on his shoulders, merely to look into his eyes again as I'd done that last night, to fix him in some time and place, so that I could deal with the excitement inside me. There was so much I wanted to tell him, so much I wanted to explain, and yet I didn't know what to say or why I would say it, only that the fullness of the feeling continued to relieve me almost to tears. This was what I'd feared lost. I didn't know where we were now, only that in my wanderings I'd passed here before, a street of ancient mansions, of garden walls and carriage doors, and towers overhead, windows of leaded glass beneath stone arches, houses of other centuries, gnarled trees, that sudden thick and silent tranquillity which means that the masses are shut out. A handful of mortals inhabit this vast region of high-ceilinged rooms. Stone absorbs the sound of breathing, the space of whole lives. Armand was atop a wall now, his arm against the overhanging bough of a tree, his hand reaching for me, and in an instant I stood beside him, the wet foliage brushing my face. Above I could see story after story rising to a lone tower that barely emerged from the dark, teeming rain. "Listen to me. We are going to climb the tower," Armand was saying. "I cannot. It's impossible. You don't begin to know your own powers. You can climb easily. Remember, if you fall, you will not be injured. Do as I do, but note this. The inhabitants of this house have known me for 100 years and think me a spirit. So if by chance they see you, or you see them through those windows, remember what they believe you to be and show no consciousness of them, lest you disappoint them or confuse them. Do you hear? You are perfectly safe. I wasn't sure what frightened me more, the climb itself or the notion of being seen as a ghost, but I had no time for comforting witticisms, even to myself. Armand had begun his boots finding the crack between the stones, his hands sure as claws in the crevices, and I was moving after him, tight to the wall, not daring to look down, clinging for a moment's rest to the thick carved arch over a window, glimpsing inside, over a licking fire, a dark shoulder, a hand stroking with a poker, some figure that moved completely without knowledge that it was watched. Gone. Higher and higher we climbed until we had reached the window of the tower itself, which Armand quickly wrenched open, his long legs disappearing over the sill, and I rose up after him, feeling his arm out around my shoulders. I sighed despite myself as I stood in the room, rubbing the backs of my arms, looking around this wet, strange place. The rooftops were silver below, turrets rising here and there through the huge rustling treetops, and far off glimmered the broken chair of a lighted boulevard. The room seemed as damp as the night outside. Armand was making a fire. From a moulding pile of furniture he was picking chairs, breaking them into wood easily despite the thickness of their rungs. There was something grotesque about him, sharpened by his grace and the imperturbable calm of his white face. He did what any vampire could do, cracking these thick white pieces of wood into splinters. Yet he did what only a vampire could do. And there seemed nothing human about him. Even his handsome features and dark hair became the attributes of a terrible angel who shared with the rest of us only a superficial resemblance. The tailored coat was a mirage, and though I felt drawn to him, more strongly perhaps than I'd ever been drawn to any living creature save Claudia, he excited me in other ways which resembled fear. I was not surprised that, when he finished, he set a heavy oak chair down for me, but retired himself to the marble mantelpiece, and sat there warming his hands over the fire, the flames throwing red shadows into his face. "I can hear the inhabitants of the house," I said to him. The warmth was good. I could feel the leather of my boots drying, feel the warmth in my fingers. "Then you know that I can hear them," he said softly. And though this didn't contain a hint of reproach, I realized the implications of my own words. "And if they come," I insisted, studying him. "Can't you tell by my manner that they won't come?" he asked. "He would sit here all night and never speak of them. We could sit here all night and never speak of them. I want you to know that if we speak of them, it is because you want to do so." And when I said nothing, when perhaps I looked a little defeated, he said gently that they had long ago sealed off this tower and left it undisturbed, and if in fact they saw the smoke from the chimney or the light in the window, none of them would venture up until tomorrow. I could see now there were several shelves of books on one side of the fireplace, and a writing table. The pages on top were wilted, but there was an inkstand and several pens. I could imagine the room a very comfortable place when it was not storming as it was now, or after the fire had dried out the air. "You see," Armand said, "you really have no need of the rooms you have at the hotel. You really have need of very little. But each of us must decide how much he wants. These people in this house have a name for me. Encounters with me cause talk for 20 years. They are only isolated instants in my time which mean nothing. They cannot hurt me, and I use their house to be alone. No one at the Theatre des Vampires knows of my coming here. This is my secret." I had watched him intently as he was speaking, and thoughts which had occurred to me in the cell at the theatre occurred to me again. Vampires do not age, and I wondered how his youthful face and manner might differ now from what he had been a century before, or a century before that. For his face, though not deepened by the lessons of maturity, was certainly no mask. It seemed powerfully expressive, as was his unobtrusive voice, and I was at a loss finally to fully anatomize why. I knew only I was as powerfully drawn to him as before, and to some extent the words I spoke now were a subterfuge. "But what holds you to the Theatre des Vampires?" I asked. "A need, naturally. But I found what I need," he said. "Why do you shun me?" "I never shunned you," I said, trying to hide the excitement these words produced in me. "You understand, I have to protect Claudia, that she has no one but me, or at least she had no one until Madeline came to live with you." "Yes," I said. "But now Claudia has released you. Yet still you stay with her, and stay bound to her as your paramour," he said. "No, she's no paramour of mine. You don't understand," I said. "Rather, she's my child, and I don't know that she can release me." These were thoughts I'd gone over and over in my mind. "I don't know if the child possesses the power to release the parent. I don't know that I won't be bound to her for as long as she—" I stopped. I was going to say for as long as she lives, but I realized it was a hollow, mortal cliché. She would live forever, as I would live forever. But wasn't it so for mortal fathers? Their daughters live forever because these fathers die first. I was at a loss suddenly, but conscious all the while of how Armand listened, that he listened in the way that we dream of others listening, his face seeming to reflect on everything said. He did not start forward to seize on my slightest pause, to assert an understanding of something where the thought was finished, or to argue with a swift, irresistible impulse, the things which often make dialogue impossible. And after a long interval he said, "I want you. I want you more than anything in the world." For a moment I doubted what I'd heard. It struck me as unbelievable, and I was hopelessly disarmed by it, and the wordless vision of our living together expanded and obliterated every other consideration in my mind. "I said that I want you. I want you more than anything in the world," he repeated, with only a subtle change of expression, and then he sat waiting, watching. His face was as tranquil as always, his smooth white forehead beneath the shock of his auburn hair without a trace of care, his large eyes reflecting on me, his lips still. "You want this of me? Yet you don't come to me. You want this of me, yet you don't come to me," he said. "There are things you want to know, and you don't ask. You see Claudia slipping away from you, yet you seem powerless to prevent it. And then you would hasten it, and yet you do nothing. I don't understand my own feelings. Perhaps they are clearer to you than they are to me. You don't begin to know what a mystery you are," he said. "But at least you know yourself thoroughly." "I can't claim that," I said. "I love her, yet I am not close to her. I mean that when I am with you as I am now, I know that I know nothing of her, nothing of anyone. She's an era for you, an era of your life. If and when you break free of her, if and when you break with her, you break with the only one alive who has shared that time with you. You fear that, the isolation of it, the burden, the scope of eternal life. Yes, that's true, but it's only a small part of it. The era, it doesn't mean much to me. She made it mean something. Other vampires must experience this and survive it, the passing of 100 eras. But they don't survive it, he said. The world would be choked with vampires if they survived it. How do you think I came to be the eldest here or anywhere? He asked. I thought about this, and then I ventured. They die by violence? No. Almost never. It isn't necessary. How many vampires do you think have the stamina for immortality? They have the most dismal notions of immortality to begin with. For in becoming immortal, they want all the forms of their life to be fixed as they are, and incorruptible. Carriages made in the same dependable fashion, clothing of the cut which suited their prime, men attired and speaking in the manner they have always understood and valued, when, in fact, all things change except the vampire himself. Everything except the vampire is subject to constant corruption and distortion. Soon, with an inflexible mind, and often even with the most flexible mind, this immortality becomes a preternatural sentence to a madhouse of figures and forms that are hopelessly unintelligible and without value. One evening a vampire rises and realizes what he has feared for perhaps decades, that he simply wants no more of life at any cost. That whatever style or fashion or shape of existence made immortality attractive to him has become swept off the face of the earth, and nothing remains to offer freedom from despair except the act of killing. And that vampire goes out to die. No one will find his remains. No one will know where he has gone. And often no one around him, should he still seek the company of other vampires. No one will know that he is in despair. He will have ceased long ago to speak of himself or of anything. He will vanish. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so that's another section of Interview with the Vampire. What are some of the things that we have noted down today? The first thing I'm going to talk about here is regarding Madeline and Madeline's character. Because Madeline, the first thing she does here is she goes into this great effort of burning down her old doll shop. And I think this burning of the doll shop is a pretty clear representation of Madeline abandoning her mortal life almost immediately and embracing vampirism and what it has to offer her in a fervent, almost fanatical manner, because she associates so much trauma with her mortal life. She was very clearly undergoing some pretty serious psychological problems in this kind of obsessive remaking of the same doll in the image of her dead child. And that trauma has all, in a way, been lifted away from her in vampirism. And she is able to kind of move on from that. Though perhaps not in a very healthy way, given she has now just formed an obsession regarding Claudia, and she now toils tirelessly to create this kind of miniature world for Claudia, in which Claudia can attain some semblance of normality, while Madeline is able to care for her as this immortal mother figure, and look after her, sort of in that symbiotic sense. In a way that Louis never really could have been symbiotic. Louis was Louis was a target to be manipulated and used, essentially. And rightfully so, I suppose, at the end of the day, because we can't ignore the very pedophilic implications of Louis' desire for Claudia, and I will never shut up about that, because it's not a good thing. Louis, while thinking about Madeline is very harsh on her, and he touches on this, but he fails to recognize his own hypocrisy in his criticism of her. And he kind of touches on this hypocrisy by remembering and hearkening back to his own fascination with Lestat in the immediate period before and after his turning into a vampire. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that he is placed in charge of her instruction. Interestingly, Claudia takes no interest in her instruction. And I think perhaps you could even suggest that Claudia kind of forcing Louis to instruct her in vampirism is a further punishment, in a sense, in which she is reminding him consistently of what he has done and making him very tangibly bring her into vampirism rather than just doing it and running away. And yet, despite the fact that he's in charge of her instruction, he blames her for the fact that she gluts herself on blood every night. And he appears to make no effort to actually stop it. So despite claiming, charge over her education, he just kind of lets her do whatever she wants, lets her run rampant. And of course, she still has moral culpability here for wanting to run around and glut herself on blood. But he makes no effort to stop her, and actively enables it by carrying her about the place when she's too full. So Madeline is obviously still evil and morally responsible here, but she is nothing particularly worse than Louis, because she kills and Louis also kills. There's not much comparable difference at the end of the day, except in how they feel about it. Madeline is perhaps more honest with herself than Louis is about what actually motivates her. One of the things that really, I couldn't even hold it back while I was reading through it, is when Louis talks about, claims that Madeline had no understanding of death. And what absolute narcissistic bullshit that is from Louis, where he claims that he has this ultimate detached understanding of death, and that she, a person who in her mortal life lost both her child and seemingly her husband, because there's no sign of him, and then her own life, would have no understanding of death. And this is because Louis thinks that after his centuries of rampant murder, he has an understanding of death. He understands death, but he doesn't understand death, does he? Louis understands murder. Louis understands going out every night and killing people. That's what he understands. And he thinks that anyone who, goes about, anytime he sees his own behavior reflected in other people, anytime other people dare act in the same evil, hypocritical, narcissistic way that Louis acts, he thinks they are lesser and wrong, but he never seeks to correct this behavior in himself. He is a narcissistic parasite. Something that Louis does achieve here, and he was getting onto it in the last section, but he finally realizes that Claudia doesn't care about him, and he finally says that explicitly. He doesn't dance around it. He says very explicitly, she felt almost nothing. He realizes it. It clicks with him at last that she hated him because he was a monster and because of what he did to her. And she needed him to survive, but she did not love him. And that was his own evil, narcissistic obsession manifesting itself. It had nothing to do with her. And despite this, his obsession still holds him to her. He has these delusions of fatherhood that he's manufactured for himself in regards to her. And it only seems to be through Armand and finding a new point of obsession that Louis is able to get anywhere close to breaking free of this hold. And of course, Louis remarks that he would never be free properly from Claudia's influence for as long as she lives, which of course is ironic because she is immortal. She will not die. She will not age. And that presents a very serious problem for both him and Armand. Talking about Armand, we have a affirmation again of the thing I've been suggesting, where Armand's fascination with Louis stems from his moral conflict and supposed humanity. And it's strange because Armand seems fascinated by Louis' humanity and inner turmoil, and the fact that he is unable to properly detach himself. He's unable to not give a shit completely, I guess is the most blunt way to put it. And yet simultaneously, Armand appears more obsessed with breaking this down than with nurturing it. He takes Louis away from outside and navigates through the city with him by paths that only a vampire can move by, or something to that effect, which appears to be pretty symbolic of the departure from human values that Armand wants to, or at least is instilling in Louis, whether he intends to or not. He wants to show Louis his power. He wants Louis to fully manifest his vampirism. And in doing this, by encouraging Louis to be more and more vampiric, he's also encouraging Louis to be less and less human. And ironically, this draws Louis away from being the very thing that he finds as a point of obsession. But we'll get to that as that develops. That's an interesting thing that we'll talk about at a better point in the text, but it's worth keeping in mind as we go forward, because I don't think Armand realizes what he's doing here. I think Armand is just prodding at Louis, trying to, figure out what's making him tick, and in that process he's kind of feeding him vampiric knowledge, I guess, because he realizes that's what Louis wants. Really interesting to think about. Final big thing I have here to talk about is we have a further explicit confirmation. Prior to this, it's been kind of implicit, but now we have explicitly that Armand just says that vampires kill themselves from meaninglessness. The reason Armand is the oldest vampire in the world, he's not in the sequels, and he's just lying for no reason here because he wants to get at Louis, I guess, which is dumb. I hate that, so I'm just not going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to accept Interview as its own, individual text where Armand just is the oldest vampire in the world. The reason he's doing that, all the other vampires have killed themselves. And he talks about this notion of having to keep up with the times as a way of preventing that meaninglessness creeping in. Because the way Armand describes it, the vampire appears to be a very conservative monster. Vampires in this text appear to epitomize this conservative, static societal influence that is reluctant and unwilling to change. Whereas in the past, in stuff like Dracula and Carmilla, you have vampires that represent outside influences that are endangering the moral fiber of society. Here, you have the vampires are endangering society, but the reason they're doing so is because of their intense conservatism and unwillingness to change, I suppose. And they that is their main point of suffering. That is what they represent. And Armand reveals that this unwillingness to change is so intense, and this feeling out of place in different times is so severe, that even trying to keep up with the times doesn't always work. And the clear implication here from Armand is that he himself is on the edge here, and needs to find something to keep him going. And what he finds is Louis. He wants to possess Louis, so that he can obsess over Louis and give himself motivation. Because it's not simply enough for him to try and keep up with the times. He has to find something to motivate him, and Louis's mysterious moral fascination and moral dilemmas are something that can do that for him. And it's fitting because this is very similar to the kind of language that Louis uses about Claudia in this bit, where he talks about Claudia's existence being the thing that gave him purpose over that time. Claudia being there was what gave him motivation. His obsession with possessing Claudia and doting over her and just owning her was what motivated him for those decades, century even. And Lestat wanted him for that same reason, you could almost suggest. Again, I think the sequels changed Lestat a great deal. But in this text, I read Lestat as a broken, lonely, abusive, narcissistic, gaslighting monster who is tragic. He's as tragic as he is despicable and unlikable. But you can see at least what is motivating him in his monstrosity. And is motivating all these vampires in their monstrosity, is just finding something to keep them going. Finding something desperately to cling on to and obsess over endlessly in this unending void of human suffering and existence that goes on and on ad infinitum. And that the tragedy is that the way they go about it never works, because they found all of their relationships on abuse and control. We're getting Hegelian here, because they never recognize each other fully, because there is always this works quite well actually, because there is always a master and a slave. They are never truly able to recognize each other, and so the relationships are always doomed. It seems that no vampire yet has tried to find meaning by just not being an asshole. And they probably should, because I think they would be a lot happier if they just recognize that they're not. They're not forced to behave like the people who created them. They are still human beings, even if they have fangs and even if they need to drink blood. They can find ways around it. They don't have to be monsters. They don't have to be bad people. And that's what this text is to me as a whole. So, I hope you enjoyed that. Great little section today. We are on the home stretch. There is about another 70 pages in the whole book. Loads of stuff is going to start kicking off now. Loads of really, really interesting stuff that we're going to get loads of cool analysis on. So I hope you stick through, and I see you again tomorrow for another little section of Interview with the Vampire. I'll see you then.